You're listening to a series on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. Most of the information in this series is drawn from Dr. Dale Allison's The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. You can find links to other episodes in this series, as well as his fantastic book, in the description. Last episode, we concluded our evaluation of what the primary sources say about Jesus' resurrection. If we can trust our sources, which seem to corroborate each other, soon after Jesus died, Mary Magdalene found an empty tomb. She and Peter told others, the former who went back to Galilee to resume his life as a fisherman. His return to the sea didn't last very long, though, because he too saw a vision of Jesus, probably while he was out on the water, which not only convinced him that Jesus is Lord, but he had physically resurrected from the dead, a rather unique take considering how, 1, the Messiah was expected to be a militant leader, and 2, the resurrection of the dead was supposed to be a mass public event. Now here's the question. Just because several sources corroborate each other, can we trust them? Primarily, would the events described in the Gospels even be possible? In his book, Dr. Allison evaluates several theories about what happened on Good Friday. Today we will explore them. Theory number 1. The burial story was developed to cover up the apostles' pain and humiliation of Jesus being dumped in some common grave. They either couldn't find the body or found it dumped in a common grave, so they invented his burial in a tomb, which would have been a much more honorable and luxurious treatment. The problem with this theory is quite apparent. Most scholars agree that Jesus was tortured and killed, in perhaps the most humiliating fashion of his age. If Christians didn't bother covering that up, why would they obsess over how he was buried? It would make no sense to let the embarrassment of the crucifixion stand, but take issue with how he was buried. Something else to note is that many stories that the gospel writers invent to fill narrative gaps are repackaged Old Testament stories. Essentially, if a story reads too closely or too similarly to an Old Testament event and is caked with a lot of theological writing, it may have been invented. And here's the thing, had Jesus' burial been a sheer invention, Dr. Allison believes that the writers would have drawn parallel after parallel after parallel with other Old Testament burial stories such as Jacob's, especially considering how the men who buried Jesus and Jacob were both named Joseph. So this theory is highly implausible. Theory number 2. Jesus was left on the cross. This is a favorite argument of many skeptics. After all, it is true that the Romans preferred to let insurrectionists rot on crosses as a public display of humiliation. That said, this was not always the case. There are stories of people's requests of bodies of loved ones being granted after their crucifixion. This would especially make sense if it was a holiday, which it was for the Jews. If anything, the Romans letting crucified bodies rot was more common in times of war for their enemies to see. And once again, if Jesus' body had been left to rot on the cross, the disciples probably wouldn't have omitted this detail out of embarrassment, considering how humiliating the rest of his death was. And if the evangelists did try covering up his death with this story, his opponents sure wouldn't have, and as far as we know, there are no ancient sources claiming that Jesus' body rotted on the cross. So this theory is also quite implausible. Theory number 3. Joseph of Arimathea was only mentioned once, so the writers probably made him up. According to Dr. Allison, this argument is flawed for several reasons. First, lots of people in the Passion narrative are mentioned only once, such as Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Second, most of the people named in the Passion narrative are believed to have really existed, such as Pilate, Peter, James, John, Mary Magdalene, and Judas. Third, usually when the gospel writers fill in the blanks for names, they either use an existing character or use a name that involves symbolism. One name in the Passion narrative that many scholars believe was made up is Barabbas, whose name literally means son of the Father. Joseph of Arimathea doesn't really mean anything, nor is Arimathea a particularly important location. All this goes to show that, on the contrary, the evidence suggests that not only was Jesus buried, but he was indeed buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Thus we have another piece of the puzzle. Theory number 4. Acts chapter 14 says the inhabitants of Jerusalem took Jesus down, and John says the Jews, not Jesus' followers, asked Pilate to have the bodies removed. First, Acts was written later than Mark, and probably just wasn't as accurate in his language as Mark was. There isn't much evidence that Luke drawn from non-Markan sources in his Passion narrative, so he probably just worded the story a little oddly. Regarding John, he doesn't specify which Jews took Jesus down, and remember that Joseph of Arimathea was indeed a Jew. Theory number 5. This is a favorite of the historical Jesus scholar John Dominic Crossan. In the Gospel of Peter, which Crossan believes predates Mark, Jesus was buried by his enemies. Okay, so a quick side note about the apocryphal Gospels, or the non-canonical Gospels. I've invoked them a few times as supporting or secondary evidence throughout the series, and it's important to note the qualifier secondary. Dr. Allison draws most of the weight of his evidence from the canonical Gospels and the Pauline epistles. Any extra canonical texts are used as just further evidence. Crossan, however, tries using them as primary evidence, which comes with great risks. Specifically, it is not a common opinion that the Gospel of Peter predates the other Gospels. In fact, the prevailing opinion today is that it came after the Gospels. Also, the passage in question says nothing about his burial. It reads, "And they drew the nails from the hands of the Lord and laid them on the earth. And the whole earth shook, and there was great fear. Then the sun shone, and it was found to be the 9th hour. And the Jews rejoiced and gave his body to Joseph that they might bury it, since he had seen all the good deeds Jesus had done." Further evidence for a burial comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The creedal statement, which uses the Greek word etaphe, means to be buried, as in buried in the ground, a cave, or a tomb. It cannot mean anything else. Finally, if the evangelists had invented the narrative of Jesus' burial, then what did Christians believe before them? There's no evidence they believed in anything else. Are we to believe that Christians just sat there for decades pondering what happened to Jesus' body until some writers came up with a story that was universally agreed upon? Regarding Joseph of Arimathea's role, if Mark had invented the story, he probably wouldn't have chosen a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish authorities, which Joseph was a part of. Mark did not like the Sanhedrin at all. If Mark had invented this story, he probably would have chosen a guy like a Roman soldier or even the centurion who believed in Jesus at the end. One last point. The Greek word Mark uses to describe Joseph's request to Pilate for the body translates into dared to ask, as in there was a distinct possibility that the request would have been denied. This checks out with non-Christian sources like Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, who report how Jews would ask for the bodies of criminals, requests that were sometimes accepted and other times denied. Dr. Allison concludes that Jesus was buried, and it was by a historical person named Joseph from Arimathea. Thus, we have an ever so slightly more complete picture of the historical Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus was crucified because of some dramatic action at the temple, which led to his branding as an insurrectionist. Upon his crucifixion, a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish elite, dared to ask Pilate for the body. His request was approved, and Joseph buried Jesus in a tomb. Within a week or so of the burial, Mary Magdalene went to check on the tomb. To her surprise, it was empty. She told Peter and possibly others about the empty tomb. Peter departed for Galilee, and somewhere around this time, Mary saw a vision of Jesus. Once Peter got to Galilee, he too saw a vision of Jesus. The most likely candidate for this first vision was when he was fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Something about this vision led Peter to conclude that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, which would have been a strange belief to hold. Furthermore, this belief that Jesus had resurrected convinced the disciples that the end times had come. This episode, we talked a lot about what happened on the day of Jesus' execution and how his burial was not only plausible, but most certainly occurred. Next episode, we'll delve into the plausibility of the Easter Sunday story in which Jesus allegedly was raised from the dead. Until next time, God bless you.